So again, thanks this afternoon. It's a pleasure to speak with everyone. Certainly thank you for the invitation, Chuck and WaterISAC. As Chuck kind of teed up, we'll be covering some information today related to the cybersecurity fundamentals. Prior to that, we'll do just a very brief introduction on nGuard so you know who we are. We'll go through some of the cybersecurity fundamentals, the three specifically that Chuck highlighted. And then as you noted at the end of this, we'll do some Q&A and hopefully have some good additional discussion on that. So just some brief kind of fast facts on nGuard, who we are. So we've been around a long time. We're a leading cybersecurity firm, been around since 2002. We really work with all major industrial, commercial, and nonprofit sectors, do a ton of work in utilities and other critical infrastructure. So we've worked with all manner of water utility, gas utilities, electrical utilities that you might imagine, as well as telecommunications and other aspects of critical infrastructure. We spend a ton of time hiring and maintaining credentialed and certified professionals with expertise in both IT and OT. So we have experience and exposure on both sides of that. And then just very briefly, if you think about the core things that we do some other tangential and peripheral areas, but our main three things that we do is advanced assessments and penetration testing, cybersecurity incident response, and managed security. Okay, so with that said, I just wanted to intro myself and the company just a little bit. We will get into the content of the presentation. So as Chuck had indicated, of course, we were invited to speak about 3 of the cybersecurity fundamentals out of the 15, and those were the ones that Chuck has already noted. I am going to take these a little bit out of order and start at F9, which is the policy one. And so talking about cybersecurity fundamental 9, which is to develop and enforce cybersecurity policies and procedures and governance. I wanted to hit this one first in our discussion, really for 2 reasons. Number one is policies oftentimes are seen as fairly dry. They're not super exciting, and they're left till the end, or they're left as an afterthought, and they're just critically important. And secondly, to give them the appropriate importance and emphasis that they should have, I wanted to hit it first in this presentation, so it would stress that as you go through this with me. So briefly, let's talk about what a policy is. Probably review, but I want to make sure. So a policy is an organizational mandate. So it's the organization, it's your utility at the highest levels communicating what must be done in the context of cybersecurity. So an example policy might be an account management policy. 2 example policy statements of that might be an inactive user account must be disabled or removed every 90 days. Another example might be all accounts must have a password expiration that complies with the organizational password policy. So again, this is what we mean when we talk about a policy being a mandate. It's a requirement that's being communicated by the organization to the employees, and as you play your role in both setting the policy and in implementing the policies inside the organization, it's the manifestation again of those mandates. Now, one of the things I wanted to also hit here briefly was something called a standard. So these are often commingled with policies, which is just fine, but a standard is a supporting aspect of a policy, as much or more so as it is a policy itself. But so basically, it tends to be either an organizational standard or a technical standard that sets the metrics or the limits or the parameterized expectations of what the policy will do. So an example of that would be, of course, a password must be reset X months. Password policies, might again dictate how long a password must be minimally to comply. So it's again organizational and technical. And another example of a technical standard might be that you might require 256-bit AES encryption for your VPN connections. That would be the 256-bit AES would be another example of a standard. So, but as you do your policies, or may have already done your policies, it's quite common for the policy and the standard to be commingled into one document set. Sometimes we see it broken out separately, and both are equally fine and best practice. The key is to is to have both the metrics or the parameters of the policies, the standards, as well as the policy content and statements themselves. One other important thing to mention before I move on is your policies should not just be best practice and tuned for your organization and the culture of your organization and maybe in general management directives, but they should specifically be aligned with your organization's target regulatory requirements. You're probably familiar with the term GRC, or governance, regulatory, and compliance, and certainly with the audience that we're talking to today, that would include things like AWEA as well as PCI DSS. Obviously, I think everybody on the call is water and wastewater utility, and then most of those organizations, process credit card transactions, payments at some level, maybe have outsourced some aspects of it, that kind of thing. So those are two examples, and there may be more that your policy should align with. One other notable, just top of mind example I would give would be, for example, if you're a utility operating in California or in another state where there are privacy, consumer privacy laws or regulations that would dictate how you have to handle information, how you have to be able to, remove information from your records upon request and things like that. And that would be another example of a GRC alignment that you might need to factor in. So the other side of the coin when we're talking about this is procedures. So whereas policy was the mandate, the procedures are the how policies are implemented. A good way to think of this is the recipe analogy. So just like you might follow a recipe to bake a cake, get your ingredients together, preheat the oven, all that kind of stuff, and go through the process. The procedure is the how to implement the policy. That explains to your staff how they need to do the things they need to do to comply with the policy. And it would typically cover both, the actual IT activity as well as things that apply to the physical environment. A couple examples would be account deactivation and removal procedure. So let's say that someone separated from your organization, they resigned and moved on to another job. You have to have a procedure that looks at the relevant policies and then describes the account deactivation and removal procedure. So the team member implementing this, or the contractor, if you're outsourcing it, knows what to do to do that correctly. And another example, of course, would be VPN user creation procedure. So you've got somebody joining, or you've got somebody who needs to be granted a VPN network for remote access. That would talk about the ways that's done in a way, again, that is done compliant with the policy and in alignment with the procedure as well. So procedures, work under the premise that they are being performed by experienced IT personnel, but they still should be reasonably detailed, including screenshots where appropriate. So the spirit of that, very simply, is, at all times we're expecting, if there's a procedure, back to the VPN example, if there's a procedure that communicates to the person how to doing the work, how to set up the VPN user, it's assumed and understood that they understand that platform, they're experienced in adding VPN users, and this is just telling them the parameters to enable, disable, things like that, the policies to apply to that VPN user as they're turned on, the authentication levels required, things like that. So one of the other things that we're doing as we go through this conversation is, for each of the fundamentals, is we're also trying to bring a practitioner's perspective. So in my organization, we work, as noted, we work with a ton of utilities and other organizations in a range of areas, and we see a lot of things, that work, a lot of challenges that some of our customers face, and so we're trying to bring some of that perspective as we go through this discussion. Some of the things I wanted to mention in the context of F9 are here. So here's an example. We say, what do we see in client environments? What scenarios are most common? So a good example is we fairly commonly come into a client environment, start working with them for the first time, and it's not atypical for them to not have really many policies, or what they do have is fairly deficient. And typically the clients that we're talking to they're very transparent and that have awareness of that. They're in a situation where they have a deficit of resources, tyranny, the urgent, and things like that, and they just, back to my earlier comment, policies and procedures tend to get prioritized down. this is the result of that, and is fairly common. Scenario 2, in some cases, we come across clients that are a little bit further along on the evolution to having a mature policy program. But scenario 2 is they do have some policies. Maybe it's a fairly complete policy set, but they're static and they're unused, and they're not being used on a daily basis. So, you know, again, a policy, ideally a policy set is something that's maintained. You know, you're certainly not changing it on a monthly basis, but typically you're reviewing it, updating it, maintaining it on an annual basis, and you're thinking about it, so forth. And you know, so scenario 2 certainly is better on that continuum of having a robust policy program, but we're still not there yet. But again, it's fairly common that we see that. Scenario 3 is of course where you want to be, and we do see this from time to time. And it's always a pleasant surprise when we do, and that's to have an actively applied policy set that's in use, so that when we audit it, it has artifacts and outcomes and output from the use of that. So if you've got a help desk system, or you've got a workflow system that's capturing workflows and documenting things were done at this time by this person, that kind of thing, we can see those artifacts, and they're a demonstration that your policy is a living, breathing thing, and that's really what we want to see. And when I say that, not just us potentially as a cybersecurity auditor, but also as that's what your management, or if management is represented on the phone here, that's what you're expecting to see in your team members, is you want to see an actively used policy set. So a couple takeaways I would add here is, number one, you know, again, the recommendation is to internally review and maintain policies on an annualized basis. Secondly, certainly do recommend incorporating policy assessments into your risk assessment process. It's recommended to have an annual risk assessment performed by a qualified third-party auditor organization, and the benefit of that is you're ensuring that you're getting some broad industry perspective and outside perspective, and that person can bring and apply, really without bias, best practices and even relevant GRC targets as well, again, like a WIA, PCI DSS, and others. Okay. So moving into the Cybersecurity Fundamental 4, which is enforced user access controls, there really are 6 different categories of controls that are laid out in WaterISAC's documentation there. So first up is role-based access control. That's a mouthful, so the industry calls it RBAC. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that. But RBAC grants or denies access to network and system resources based on job function or role in this case. So to illustrate that point, 2 examples, first of which is, and I know I'm saying the obvious, but it's good to illustrate the point. A SCADA operator shouldn't have the ability to add users to payroll for the obvious reasons. So that's an example of a negative example of role-based access control. And then by the same token, HR shouldn't have the ability to open and close a water valve or change PLC settings. So that, you know, and by using role-based access control, folks would only have access to the specific capabilities and functions they need to do their job. So onto the next category for user access controls, and this is related to RBAC for sure, is the principle of least privilege. So this concept means that a user account or a system account should only be granted those permissions explicitly required, but no others. So again, related to role-based access control, but is slightly different because there's aspects of this that potentially have nothing to do with roles. It's just the notion is literally users will only be granted the access they need to do their job. And beyond that, if there's tangential accesses and benefits that are outside of their role, again, they will only be given those accesses. So, you know, for example, if someone's a SCADA operator, in addition to be a SCADA operator and accessing the control systems and the monitoring systems and the alerts and so forth, they have general things that they do. For example, they need access to corporate email, they need access to other corporate systems, maybe things to enroll in benefits, things like that. Again, principle of least privilege would apply. So to further illustrate that point, though, 2 examples. A customer service rep shouldn't have the ability to install a new application on their desktop, just because that's not something that's required for their day-to-day activity. And also, if they did have that ability, it might actually introduce some vulnerabilities which could be exploited by malware or by an outside hacker, or even an internal hacker as well. Another example would be a remote VPN user shouldn't have unrestricted access to business and SCADA networks. So even though that VPN user legitimately might need access to parts of the business network and parts of the SCADA networks to do their daily job, again, they should be limited to only that which they are explicitly required. So again, principle of least privilege. It takes more time to do this, but it makes a dramatic difference in reducing your attack surface, both within and without your organization. So moving on to this one, this one's an interesting one because it gets a lot of discussion, but still is often such a big weak spot for a lot of organizations, and that is password hygiene. So strong password hygiene equals strong security, right? You can do so many things right, but if you have weak or deficient passwords, it may not matter. You just may be extremely vulnerable to compromise, again, to malware, an outside hacker, even an internal rogue resource. So some general things to think about and consider. Long passwords are better. I know it's kind of obvious, but in recent years, there's been a ton of discussion about that. NIST has provided additional guidelines. That's actually referenced in the Cybersecurity Fundamentals documentation, and I'll give an example here in just a moment. But then also, you want to enforce minimum password requirements where possible. So it's, once there's typically a part of your policy that speaks to passwords, there's also a part of it that would speak to, there are technical controls that you can and should implement everywhere from the VPN to Active Directory or whatever the case is, to try to enforce those minimums so that you've got both the policy control, but you've also got the technical control to help enforce the policy as well. One thing I want to mention real quick back on the longer passwords are better. So, if you went back 10 years ago or so, the conventional wisdom was having a 12-character password that was essentially random with a very wide character set, punctuation, uppercase, lowercase, symbols and so forth, numbers. That if you had that 12 characters compared to a 20-character or 30-character password that was made of commonly used English language words, the general consensus was, well, the 12-character password's the better password because it's basically just a random set of characters. That's changed a bit over the last 3 and 4 years. There's a notion that literally length of password really trumps almost all other considerations. And this has also been born out of, just as human beings, what can we digest, process, what can we remember and retain from a password management standpoint. So to illustrate that point, and this would be an excessive password for sure, but just to illustrate the point. So one scenario would be, you could have a password which is legitimately something that you might say to someone, as an example, next year's vacation to the Florida Keys is going to be fantastic. So in that example, if you use some punctuation at the end of it, you're using your uppercase, lowercase, you've got your spacing in there, that works out to be about 66 characters. That would literally, that simple phrase, pretty easy to remember, is a 66-character password. Now I'm not making that recommendation. Everybody needs to rush out and do a 66-character password, but I'm trying to make the point that from a cracking analysis, from a brute force dictionary, a hybrid cracking analysis standpoint, it is essentially an unbreakable password unless you're a nation state. And then even if you are a nation state, typically only with months, years potentially of focus would you crack that password, versus a 12-character password or even a 15-character password of totally random characters, which is hard to remember, and quote unquote random. The longer password is easier to remember and is more secure. So just to illustrate that point. Now, one other key tool in the toolbox, and this is specifically talked about in the Cybersecurity Fundamentals, is this notion of using a password management system or software such as LastPass or Dashlane, and there's many others, by the way. I mean, there's not to plug those particular technologies, but an approach that we've seen be pretty successful with our clients over the years is to use one of these password management systems. You might have a very rigorous, passphrase-based password that you would use to get into your password management software. And then as you're creating and managing the credentials for the various systems and applications and so forth that you access, you would use that software system to generate a unique password per account, per application, or per system. And if you've not looked at these systems before, that might be mind-blowing to hear someone suggest that. But the thing I would tell you, having been a consumer and user of these systems for many years now, many years, over 5 certainly at least, the software really makes that a simple thing, a fairly automated thing. The only thing you typically would have to remember is to, again, is to have your very long master password to get into the password manager initially. And then after that, the software is plugging in the information automatically as you do the things that you do in your daily job. There can be some exceptions, but it's typically pretty manageable. So, I mean, for that reason, again, to just use myself as an example, I might have 1 or 2 examples, but where this isn't the case. But I probably have, 200 to 300 accounts in my password manager, and that each and every one of them have a unique password. Technically, that was randomly generated by the password system. Most of which, if allowed by the application or system, probably are in excess of 50 characters. And that, again, that probably sounds radical that someone would suggest that, but that is actually possible and actually easy to do in a system like this. So wanted to share that, give that some perspective. It can make a huge difference along with these other techniques in improving your password hygiene, and which again this is often such a weak point for an organization. So I'm a big proponent of it. I already talked about in my own usage, and again, this is part of this is a cybersecurity fundamental, is to assign unique passwords per account. And last but not least, I definitely wanted to hit this, is don't use default passwords. So I can't tell you the number of times when our team will come in, they'll be doing a penetration test, for example, and they'll come across a router, a print server, a surveillance camera, a DVR, I mean, you name it, or even in some cases, something on the OT side of the house, whether it's a PLC or whatever, and the credentials in use are actually the default credentials that came from the manufacturer that were meant to be changed immediately upon setup and just never were. And that's such a huge vulnerability that you just have to avoid ever staying with default passwords and make that part of your provisioning process. Okay, moving on to multi-factor authentication. I suspect everybody knows what this is, but I did want to hit this briefly and just talk about it. So multi-factor authentication is where you have, where to access a system, an application, a network, a VPN, whatever, you would have to use 2 or more unique factors. And a factor is a different category of authentication information or access that you have to have. So to illustrate the point, one example would be something which is, this is what everybody's most familiar with, right? So this is a password or a PIN that you just have in your head that you recall and have access to. Secondly, though, another example, totally different factor here. So it's not another password, but totally different factor is something that you physically have in your possession, a hardware token. This can be back in the old days. This was your RSA, fobs that had the rotating pins on them, but you had to have that physically in your possession. Now in modern days, most everybody has got a smartphone, and they actually have a software client, which that is the something you have. So basically, you have to have your smartphone with that client with that rotating pin to be that second factor. And then third, and of course, most everybody's familiar with this, probably at least on their smartphones, but this is increasingly becoming something used in desktop laptop environments and in various industries, which is the biometric component as well. So another factor can be you would have to have a fingerprint, a facial recognition scan, or an eye scanner, or something like that. So these are 3 things. Individually, they're hard to duplicate. Probably the easiest one to steal or to duplicate, if you had a way to get it out of somebody, would be the password, but the others are much more difficult. So when you take a traditional password in combination with one of these other factors, it makes you tremendously more hardened against external attack, just tremendously valuable. I will say, one of the things that we do, in fact, we have 1 or 2 going on right now where we do social engineering for clients, and our pen testers hate to hear that our client uses multi-factor authentication when they're doing social engineering, because it greatly increases the difficulty of us having success in terms of phishing people, or doing phishing over a phone, or doing smishing over a text, or have some other instant messaging type client. Multi-factor is a really difficult control to circumvent. Not impossible, but it's challenging. So almost done with user access control. I've got two more. So just briefly here. So the secure remote access solutions. This is a key component, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. But this is a key component. Three of the main tools in the toolbox that's cited in the cybersecurity fundamentals. The first of which is jump boxes. These are basically intermediate servers that go in DMZ networks. So it's a workstation. So server can be a virtualized environment in some cases, where someone who's needing to perform a remote function, whether it's a vendor, whether it's a remote worker, teleworker, whatever the case is, they have to get into the jump box to then be able to pivot from the DMZ to the interior network. The second bullet is, again, I suspect everybody's familiar with it, especially these days, is a virtual private network. So that allows your business and SCADA networks to be extended to remote users. And so just a critical capability, and if done correctly, can do it in a secure way. And then last but not least is SSH. And this is a long time, been around for decades now, utility and protocol that allows for secure terminal emulation, as well as secure file transfer. All three of those are major tools in the toolbox. A couple of things to think about though as you're implementing these tools and providing for secure remote access. Number one, make sure you're using RBAC. Make sure you're using your role-based access controls. Just because something's over an encrypted tunnel doesn't mean we get to skip the other steps. So make sure you focus on that. Principle of least privilege still must be applied as well. Always use multi-factor authentication for VPNs. I can't tell you the number of times that we see a VPN get compromised, either in a breach that we research, or even in our own pen testing we do for customers, because multi-factor is not in use. So you just have to use it. It dramatically increases the difficulty for both the white hat and the black hat hackers. And then number three, SSH is phenomenal technology, can really enable you to do a lot of things security, so definitely highly recommend using it. However, if you have systems where it's not being used, it is essential that you disable SSH on those systems. Again, this is cited in the cybersecurity fundamentals explicitly. It's you got to turn this off on this host, because if you don't, they will quite often be configured in their default configuration, which can be insecure, and they oftentimes will even be at a version that has vulnerabilities that are unpatched and so forth. So the moral of the story there is make sure to turn that off on a given host, system, or device if it's not in use. All right, lastly for F4 is offboarding. So of course, it's just a fact of life that folks move on from time to time, and you may have someone's been with the organization for 5 years and they move on to a different, they're going to take a different job, different industry, or whatever the case may be. So when that happens, though, of course, there are things that you have to do on your side from a user access control standpoint. Specifically, whether it's an employee, a vendor, or a contractor, you have to revoke their access to specific types of assets. Some examples of that would be access to servers and devices and routers and switches on the network, general network access if you're using some type of network access control, VPNs, cloud assets if you've got, if you're a G Suite user or workspace, I think it's called now, if you're a Microsoft 365 organization, those aspects have to be addressed as well. And it needs to include everything, not just IT, but operational technology as well. Super important, of course, for the folks that are, monitoring and managing your pumping infrastructure and so forth. Also, too, there's a tendency to focus specifically on the things that are at the headquarters, at the data center, and whatnot. But you got to make sure that you think about all the locations you have where there is IT infrastructure that they might have access to, or there might be some type of surveillance or remote access system to even enter a facility, or whatever the case would be. So make sure you're thinking through that, your physical locations, including the headquarters, your data center facility, if that's a separate facility. Some people have co-location facilities they use. Disaster recovery sites, warehouses you might use to store equipment or spare parts, or again, spare equipment. Distributed sites such as pumping stations and reservoirs. Again, when things are working, for a lot of customers, they may not get frequent visits to that site, so they out of sight, out of mind. They can be forgotten or overlooked. So just make sure in your procedures for offboarding that you don't overlook those, and you're including all aspects of that. So a couple other important points to make here is, make sure your procedure also handles employees who change roles laterally within the organization. So for example, let's say someone was a SCADA operator and they wanted to do something different, and they applied and got accepted, and they moved over and became a network administrator for IT, as an example. So obviously their SCADA accesses, permissions, and privileges have to go away, and then they have to be granted the new accesses for IT. So make sure you don't overlook that. And then also the Cybersecurity Fundamental 4 also recommends that you have an audit step in your deprovisioning process, just a chance for someone to review, to look, to see if there's things that are missing, things that may have been overlooked, because the reality is no one organization's environment is static. Things change over time, and there may be some additional things that need to be done, just given very recent changes that the audit will turn up. Okay, so just some perspective on this before we move on to our final fundamental. So again, on user access control, some things to think about here. So failure to implement these fundamentals that we're talking about can have severe consequences. Some of these have been, well, not some of these, both of these examples I would cite here have been in the news, and for the folks across the South and the Southeast have actually directly impacted their daily lives. Let's talk about the Colonial pipeline breach first. So we all know what that was. Everyone read the news, and that was hugely impactful. But a little different, or a little additional color commentary about that is, so the way this happened was there was a legacy user, technically someone who was no longer affiliated with Colonial Pipeline. They had, due to a procedural gap, potentially a policy gap, they had retained a valid user account on the VPN. So they weren't actually working anymore, but their username and password credentials were still valid. And another unfortunate mistake, it appears to be the case that same credential pair, that same username and password, or at least the same password, was used elsewhere on other systems, probably systems outside of that particular utility, maybe eBay or whatever general personal accounts they might have and things like that may have been involved in a breach. Well, that password got associated with that email address. It got made its way to the dark web and was out there for sale and reuse by the dark web, by hackers, bots, malware, and so forth. And that's basically what happened. Is they found an account that was valid on this VPN, and they tried a password that was associated with that email address that was just out there on the dark web, and it worked. And they were into the Colonial pipeline, and the rest is history. Everybody knows what that's about. I won't belabor that too much. But so again, VPN user account was left unaddressed, and then they, again, didn't use unique passwords, usernames, and accounts per account, per application, per system, and that's what got them here. And then even closer to home from an industry standpoint, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Florida water treatment plant breach that occurred at the end of last year, or at least, it came out, was publicized at the end of last year, beginning of this. In that example, they had a insufficiently secured remote access solution, which led to the unauthorized introduction of increased water treatment chemicals into the water system. And while thankfully the amount of chemicals, additional chemicals that were introduced weren't enough to make the water supply unsafe, which was great. From an increase standpoint, they actually did increase the chemical quantities being injected into the water supply, I think by orders of magnitude. So as a proof of concept, a pretty staggering breach, pretty major breach. I'm sure I'd be shocked if the organizations represented on this discussion today actually haven't had discussed this in length or in depth rather, and talked about implications and things they should be doing differently on their side. But so again, back to the fundamentals, F4 specifically, they were using a insecure remote access solution that wasn't properly configured, wasn't properly locked down, and that led to this breach in part. And just as a side note, just to mention it too, over on the right, you'll see these are some security advisory updates that we publish periodically. We'll cover topics like this, such as Colonial pipeline, such as the Florida water treatment plant hack, and so forth. This is a service we make available to really everybody for free. If you're interested in this, stop by our website and you can subscribe with your email address, and you'll get these as we do these going forward. So just to mention that. All right, very good. So coming down the home stretch here on the final fundamental, which is F7, which is embrace vulnerability management. Definitely wanted to hit this because it's super important. This is vulnerability management really is an ongoing process that really never stops. It's not a one-time thing. You do it, you review the results, you address it, and you're good. You do it on an ongoing basis. It is a constant cycle of identification, remediation, mitigation, retesting of vulnerabilities, basically. When we talk about some of the specific keys to doing this and being successful at it, there's really 4 things we want to think about. First of which is you want to include in the process, in your vulnerability management process and practice, you want to include this notion of auditing new systems and devices. So you want to make sure that as you stand up a new server, as you bring on a new PLC, as whatever the case is, you want to make sure this is included in your vulnerability management process. So before it goes into production use, you can see the vulnerabilities that were present on the system and address them. And then by the same token, as I mentioned already, vulnerability management is an ongoing thing. So you have to just continually audit existing systems and devices. The vulnerability profiles of these systems will change over time. You'll have a situation sometimes where a new vulnerability will become known. It wasn't known in August, but as we stand now in September, there's a new vulnerability out that maybe a significant portion of your infrastructure is vulnerable to it. And if you're doing ongoing vulnerability management, you'll find out about it, you'll have awareness of it, and you'll have some head start on how to address it. So this is an ongoing activity that happens throughout the year typically. Another key to success here, and this will probably be obvious, but it's often overlooked, is include everything. There's a tendency to use a sampling approach to vulnerability management, or to even by accidental oversight, is to miss part of your infrastructure. So maybe include the business systems, but forget and leave out the OT side of the house. To maybe do everything that's on premise, but leave out the things that are in the cloud, and so forth. So the spirit of this is include everything, because playing defense is hard, but vulnerability management is a key part of playing defense. But when you're the defender, it literally only takes you getting 1 or 2 things wrong, and then someone can get in. So just in the spirit of making sure you're crossing all your T's, dotting all your I's, you definitely need to include everything in your environment to make sure you're not missing it. Last but not least, the sad reality is that most every organization that I've ever worked with will have an application. It's a legacy app, it's a legacy system that is on an old operating system. It may even be no longer supported by the vendor, but given what it does, given its importance in the organization, they may not have an easy way to replace it. So again, just to understanding that reality is there, and it is what it is. One of the key things, one of the key tools and the keys to success here really is segment those systems that can't be fixed. So if you've got systems that fit into that category, put them off in their own separate subnet, their own separate VLAN, implement additional controls like router ACLs or firewall ACLs to restrict the types of traffic that can come into that VLAN, implement intrusion prevention, things like that to provide protection for the vulnerabilities that are on this system that you can't address on the system itself. And if you do those 4 things, you will dramatically enhance your vulnerability management, and you'll get the benefit that you're looking for out of that capability. So a couple final comments here from a practitioner standpoint perspective. So back to the Florida water treatment plant breach, just to hit it again briefly. So the whole breach started, the breach initially actually started because they were using vulnerable, no longer supported operating systems that were operational on their network. You know, not all the details about this particular breach are known, but it strongly suggests that a vulnerability management program was not in place, because if it had been, you know, you're getting those in the reports every month, every quarter, whatever the interval is, to know that you've got severely deficient and vulnerable systems, and they're still in the network. They're still in the network, and you're seeing that every single month. And it gives you things that you can take to the rest of the team and get consensus and buy-in to get those things addressed. And then secondly, you know, again, as noted before, while not optimal, you know, again, if there's no migration path and you cannot take those vulnerable systems and applications offline, you can put them on a network segmentation. And the clear implication here was that was not done, which again led to this breach. So my final comment on vulnerability management is that vulnerability management is complementary to penetration testing, not a substitute. We sometimes see folks try to use them interchangeably. They're really very different things that get you, they're related, but they're very different things. So just to keep that in mind, is vulnerability management something that you would do on just a perpetual basis, typically, you know, monthly, quarterly, that type of interval, whereas penetration testing is quite commonly done on an annual basis, by contrast. Okay, so that's F7 in a nutshell, and that brings us to Q&A. And so I will look over to Chuck and see if we have any questions.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. That was a fantastic presentation. Really appreciate you going into depth and providing all those perspectives. Going back to your discussion of the first one, or at least in the order that you proceeded with number 9, like the kind of the maturity levels that you indicated with the different scenarios. I thought that was interesting, so thank you. But first question, we do have several questions. And the first one is going back to that fundamental number 9, and it is in a client scenario where there are actively used policies. Typically, how many policies are there, and how many pages does it take to describe them?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I would say, depends on how you define policies. I would say typically most of our customers tend to put their entirety of all their policy statements and all their policies into one logical document. You can have them separately. You can certainly have them separately if that's appropriate and that's the preference, but to typically have it in one document. And then if we look into the table of contents of that one document, don't hold me to this, but it's probably something like 20 or so macro policies. And again, depending on the organization, depending on the GRC, alignment, OEA, PCI DSS, and so forth, there might be 50 to 70 pages in that policy document. And that would be the policy document, and then the procedures would be different, and they would be on a, as needed basis, tuned to your organization.
Great, thanks, Jim. And I had a follow-up question with regards to this area and this fundamental, and it's do you often see, and maybe this you can speak to this as far as this is a best practice or something you're not seeing that commonly, when people or organizations update their policies, are they also similarly, do you see them updating things like training so that
yes.
When things are being obviously a new policy, but are they taking the necessary actions to reflect those changes there too, so that's staying
absolutely
current?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Great point. And I know this maps even to another cybersecurity fundamental in terms of security awareness, training, and so forth. But absolutely, yeah. That is, as those policies and procedure changes are made and so forth, definitely that would tune or adjust or add to your existing training that you might do on a quarterly or annual basis.
Great, thanks, Jim. Next question goes on to, you talked about passwords for a bit. That was really interesting. And the question is, how long of a password do you like to have for your important accounts? I know you put out some lengths there, at least like the ones that maybe were previously recommended, but any recommendations, or at least what do you have for what would you advocate for your important accounts?
Yeah, if you're going to get, I'm a big proponent. I think it's obvious at this point of using long passphrases with punctuation and case and so forth as you're doing that. But I comment, just to use myself as an example. I commonly, for my important accounts, I commonly use 30 and 50 character passphrases that are super easy for me to remember. They may be a verse from a song. They may be a quote from a book, things that are just super easy for me to remember. And because they're not, mixed punctuation, because they're not a typical what you would think of as a password, they're also relatively easy to type as well.
Great, yeah, that's impressive, that length. Thank you. The next one, kind of similar, is talking about multi-factor authentication, and you made a point about, how it makes it difficult, makes the job difficult when you come into an organization and you see that. But so what else besides multi-factor authentication do your pen testers hate to see the utility using, or any other organization for that matter?
Let's see. Well, so some of the things that so if I'm picking on, a couple of things just top of mind would be, if we're talking about social engineering, our pen testers hate to see strong perimeter email security controls, because those can be, those are great for actually stopping and restricting and constraining to a great degree phishing attacks, bulk phishing, spear phishing, whaling, and like attacks. And so, they often make it challenging for us to show some good results when we're doing social engineering. But ultimately, that's a good thing that bad for us is good for our customers. Another example that I would point out to is intrusion prevention, whether that's implemented on the endpoint or that's implemented in the at the perimeter on a multifunction next-gen firewall, or whatever the case is. Intrusion prevention can play a major role in retarding and restricting a white hat hacker, or a black hat for that matter, and doing the things that they do. So we hate to see that. I know some of the folks from the team have joined this call, and they're participants, so they can't chime in. I'm sure they're shouting some things at me right now, but those are two good examples I would give.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jim.
Sure.
And the next question, and this goes back to the last fundamental that you were discussing, I believe, embrace vulnerability management. The question is, what is the difference between remediation and mitigation in vulnerability management?
Yeah, great question. So remediation is literally the corrective action, right? So if there was a vulnerability, and let's say that you've got a web server that's used internally, maybe to do whatever. You've got an internal web application. Maybe it runs a version of Apache, and that has a vulnerability. So the vulnerability management practice would identify that vulnerability, would tell you about it, would let you know what you needed to do to correct it. That's, again, what we call the remediation. So that's an example of remediation. Mitigation is technically something you do when you can't remediate it. So specifically, back to my keys to success, number 4 technically is a mitigation. So if we can't correctly remediate the vulnerabilities on that host system because maybe it's running Windows 7 or whatever the case is, and there are no more patches coming for that operating system, or the application is unsupported, there's no more updates coming for the application, so we can't fix it. Mitigation, number 4, is an example of a mitigation, which is to segment that system in a protected enclave so that it's not easily attacked.
Great, thanks, Jim. Appreciate that explanation. I think we have time for just probably a couple more questions, and I'm going to apologize right now to the audience if we didn't have time to pose your question, but we can follow up afterwards and send those questions to Jim and maybe get some insights from that. But the next question is, my organization has automated vulnerability scans performed twice a year. I hear from others that vulnerability scans are not enough and we should have penetration tests performed. Would you agree? And if so, where should we start?
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to make that point actually earlier in the vulnerability management control. So vulnerability management is a highly automated, can be more prone to false positives, inaccurate results than normal. And it's also, again, it's also the basic, automated things that a tool can do. A tool can scan and things like that. So penetration testing, by contrast, is where those same steps are performed, but then a lot takes place. That's probably 10% of the activity in a penetration test. and the balance of the time is actually a person, and a security pen tester, engineer, et cetera, thinking about what we're getting back in terms of vulnerabilities, actually trying to exploit the vulnerability, trying to demonstrate whether that's actually exploitable or not, and then if it is exploitable, what the actual impact of that is. Are we able to get further into the network, go more north-south? Are we able to make lateral movement in the organization, move to other systems on the same network, and then maybe get some additional depth in the organization? So penetration is highly recommended. I would say, there's many firms out there that do pen testing. This is a kind of a golden age for cybersecurity, and that there's just a ton of quality firms out there you could work with. We do it, obviously, be glad to talk to you about that. But there's a lot of good pen testing firms out there. And certainly if you want a couple recommendations, email me. Certainly you could go to Google or other resources like that as well.
Great, thanks, Jim. And final question, have you heard about Microsoft's passwordless solution in conjunction with multi-factor authentication? If so, what are your thoughts, and do you recommend organizations to take that route?
So I believe if I'm tracking correctly, I think this just got announced last week. I almost brought this up in the presentation, but the reality is I haven't been able to review it enough to dig into it further. There's a high likelihood that we're going to be pushing an advisory out about that in the coming weeks as we have a chance to jump into it. So I would certainly, for any folks that are interested, again, go to nGuard.com/blog, and we'll be providing some guidance on that in the near future. But the quick version is I would point to that you want to look for multi-factor authentication, however it's implemented. So it's fine. Not using a password is fine, but you have to make sure the other categories are present. And so I certainly would encourage folks to make sure, if you're not using a password, that you're using a token and you're using biometric and have two factors represented.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim.